Let's have a conversation about dangling modifiers. Dangling modifiers are a concept in writing that are not always that clearly understood, even by people who do a lot of writing. Very often you'll encounter that concept for the first time in a markup of a paper that some professor has marked up and mentioned to you as being a problem with something you wrote in a paper that you submitted. And the problem with dangling modifiers is that they make your writing unclear. They do not communicate clearly and accurately with the reader. In fact, they often mislead the reader, and the result is sometimes even humorous. So you have a major distraction from however you want to look at it. So let's look at this Purdue OWL Online Writing Lab example worksheet to walk through the concept of a dangling modifier and see what we can learn about it. So we'll start on the top with a definition here. Just below that little box there, it says a dangling modifier is a word or phrase that modifies a word not clearly stated in the sentence. Okay, that means that the sentence doesn't contain any reference to what the modifier is describing, and that's confusing. Now, a modifier, on the other hand, it says describes, clarifies, or gives more detail about a concept. So when you misplace a modifier or you have a dangling modifier, you're missing the reference for that modifier. Let's look at an example here. In our sentence below here says, having finished the assignment, Jill turned on the TV. Having finished is an action. It's a modifier. It tells us something. So in English sentences, the doer must be the subject of the action in the clause that follows. So we have an action followed by an actor. So if we don't mention that in the first clause of the sentence, we do have to get to it immediately in the next clause. So in this sentence, the actor is Jill, and she seems to be the one doing the action, having finished being the action. So this sentence does not have a dangling modifier. It's fine. Let's look at a sentence that does have a dangling modifier. Okay, having finished the assignment, the TV was turned on. I'm going to scroll up here so we can see this better on the screen. Having finished the assignment, the TV was turned on. Having finished is a participle expressing action. But the doer is not the TV set, which it would seem to be, judging from the way that sentence reads. The subject of the main clause. The TV sets don't finish assignments, as much as we might wish they did for us, so we could watch what's on TV instead of doing an assignment we don't want to do. So since the doer of the action expressed in the participle has not been clearly stated in the participle phrase is said to be dangling. It's a dangling modifier. There's no reference to what it's modifying, or there's a confusing reference as to what it's modifying. So it's kind of humorous in a way. Strategies for revising dangling modifiers are several. You can completely restructure the sentence, or you can make a small adjustment sometimes. So let's look at some examples and see what it takes to unravel the problem of a dangling modifier. So here's a dangling modifier. Having arrived late for practice, a written excuse was needed. We can see the obvious problem here. A written excuse does not arrive late for practice. And so we need to figure out who did arrive late for practice, and so we can put this in a different context if we know what we're trying to write about here. And our sentence might more clearly read, or would be more clear and more precise, if it read, having arrived late for practice, the team captain needed a written excuse. So there we have a modifier in that participle phrase that refers clearly to the team captain, which makes sense. So the main clause now names that person. In our second example here, we're going to change the phrase that dangles into a complete introductory clause by naming the doer of the action in that clause. So we have, without knowing his name, it was difficult to introduce him. Confusing. It's just not a sentence that really works because we're missing something. What are we missing? We didn't know his name. The sentence says, it didn't know his name. Who didn't know his name? To revise this sentence, decide who is trying to introduce him. And if you have that information, you just merely need to include that. So the revision might be, because Maria did not know his name, it was difficult to introduce him. So you've done a little bit more jostling around to change this sentence. But it does correct the problem and makes it clear and adds information that the reader really needs to understand what you're saying here. Let's look at the third example. Combine the phrase and the main clause into one is another way of correcting a dangling modifier, and that would be an example here. The incorrect way of making this, of looking at this, would be to improve his results. The experiment was done again. Confusing. To improve whose results? Who wanted to improve the results? Not the experiment. The experiment is an inanimate concept here. So to improve and correct that, he improved his results by doing the experiment again. It gets rid of the dangling modifier. So your structure is less important when you correct it than finding a way to correct it that clarifies the problem and confusion that results from the dangling modifier. Let's look at some more examples here at the end. Incorrect would be, after reading the original study, the article remains unconvincing. Obviously, the article is not reading the study. So revising that correctly to make it clear, after reading the original study, I find the article unconvincing. You could say he finds the article unconvincing if that were what you're trying to write about. But you do need to make that change. An incorrect version here of a modifier that's trying to do something that is incorrect is relieved of your responsibilities at your job. Your home should be a place to relax. Your home was not relieved of responsibilities. So to revise that, you might say, relieved of your responsibilities at your job, you should be able to relax at home. That's clear, that's straightforward, that's understandable. No confusion. In our last example, the experiment was a failure, not having studied the manual carefully. The experiment was a failure, not having studied the lab manual carefully. Again, the experiment did not do the studying. So revising that, you might say they failed the experiment not having studied the lab manual carefully. So they is the actor, that which is being modified by your next clause here. So these are some examples of dangling modifiers, things that make your writing unclear. So to avoid them, look for them. You really need to just go through your writing and make sure you're not using a modifier without a reference, without something that it is modifying contained in the sentence. And if it's not contained in the clause, then it needs to be in the next clause. And you need to find a way to correct that, or you're going to be misleading, you're going to be amusing in many instances. But the main problem is you're going to be unclear in what you are trying to communicate to the reader. That'll take care of it for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next lecture.